A soft wind moves over the quiet fields of southern Norway. The dawn mist lingers like a veil over the grass, dimming the horizon into shades of gray and pale gold. There is no sound except for the slow hum of insects and the distant call of a lone bird somewhere beyond the hill. Yet beneath this peaceful landscape, beneath centuries of silence, something ancient waits. The soil here carries more than roots and stones, it carries memory. The ground remembers everything: footsteps, battles, burials, storms. And one morning, it begins to whisper again. A small research team had come to the valley, guided not by myth but by measurements. Their tools were modern, ground-penetrating radar, data tablets, a van humming softly in the distance, but their curiosity was old as humankind itself. They were searching for patterns beneath the earth, traces of settlements or burial mounds lost to time. The farmers of the region had told stories about strange mounds, about plow blades that struck wood instead of stone, but those tales had faded into the rhythm of ordinary life. No one truly believed that anything extraordinary could lie hidden beneath their fields. As the radar unit glided across the soil, its screen pulsed with faint reflections, thin lines, curves, a symmetry that seemed unnatural. At first, no one noticed. It looked like noise, like countless surveys before it. But then one of the technicians leaned closer. There it was, a long, curved shadow beneath the surface, perfect in its outline. It arced like the spine of some colossal creature buried in slumber. The team fell silent. They all stared at the image, realizing they were not looking at random formations. They were seeing the ghost of a ship. The air changed in that moment. Even the sound of wind seemed to pause, as if the land itself was listening. The archaeologists spoke in low voices, their excitement carefully restrained. They marked the coordinates, took fresh readings, and confirmed the impossible. Beneath the farmland lay a full-sized Viking ship, preserved by time, untouched for more than 1,000 years. Its timbers, though decayed, had left a perfect imprint in the earth, a negative of what once was. The discovery felt like waking a god from dream. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the field looked ordinary again. A tractor passed along the road. Children played near a barn. The soil, disturbed only by thin white survey flags, seemed calm and timeless. Yet everyone who had seen the radar image carried the same quiet awe. They understood they had found not merely a ship but a story, one written in earth instead of ink, a story buried by centuries of rain and roots. The team returned to their lodgings that night, their thoughts restless. Some imagined the ship in its glory, carved from oak, its hull shining in salt water, its sails swelling with wind. Others thought of the people who built it, men and women who watched the same sky but lived in a world filled with spirits, gods, and sea storms. The archaeologist leading the project, an older man with silver hair, stared at the printed scans spread across the table. He traced the shape of the vessel with his finger, whispering softly that this was something unique. Perhaps the best preserved ship burial ever found in mainland Norway. Perhaps the key to an untold chapter of the Viking world. Outside, the night deepened. The wind brushed against the old wooden cottages, carrying the scent of wet soil and pine. Somewhere out in the field, foxes moved silently through the mist. The earth was still but not lifeless. Beneath its layers, ancient wood and iron lay intertwined with clay, waiting. Each season that had passed since its burial had pressed it deeper into the memory of the land, until even memory itself forgot. Now, by chance, or fate, it had been heard again. In the coming weeks, the small discovery would ripple outward. Government permits would be filed. Journalists would arrive. Scholars from across Europe would request access to the data. Yet on this first night, the discovery remained a secret shared among a handful of people. It was fragile, sacred in its quietness. They did not yet know who had been buried there or what treasures might rest within. They did not even know if the ship still contained bones or relics. All they knew was that something extraordinary lay just beneath their feet. And so the valley kept its silence. The mist thickened once more, rolling over the fields in soft waves. The stars appeared above the dark line of forest, and the moon rose like a pale coin through thin clouds. From above, the land looked serene and eternal, hiding its secret well. But under that thin crust of soil, history waited. Timber, iron, ash, bone, all woven together in a cradle of earth. The shape of a forgotten age, the echo of hands that once built and sailed across storm-lit seas. It is said that the earth holds its breath when something sacred is near. That night, if one had stood in the field long enough, one might have felt it, the faint pull of the past, the almost human heartbeat of the ground itself. The Viking ship, sleeping through 1,000 winters, had stirred at last. And as the stars drifted overhead, the soil of Norway began to dream again of sails, of oars slicing water, of voices carried across the wind. The whisper beneath the soil had been heard, and nothing in that valley would ever be the same again. The following morning broke with a thin, uncertain light. The mist that had hidden the valley for days lifted slowly, revealing long streaks of gold across the damp fields. Dew shimmered on the tall grass, and the faint rumble of a tractor echoed in the distance. To anyone passing by, it was just another ordinary day in rural Norway. But to the archaeologists standing near the flagged markers, the air felt different, alive, expectant. They gathered near the spot where the strange radar readings had been taken, their boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The lead archaeologist, Anders Lund, held a printout of the radar image in his hand. The curved outlines stared back at him like a question from another time. The farmer who owned the land, a quiet man named Torvald, stood a few steps away, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. His family had worked this same field for generations, growing barley and potatoes, never suspecting that something from another world lay just beneath their plow lines. When Anders told him what the team believed they had found, Torvald didn't speak right away. He looked over the soil, then at the distant tree line, as if searching for an answer in the landscape itself. "My grandfather used to say," he murmured, "that the ground remembers what men forget." Then he nodded once, slow and solemn, and agreed to let the dig begin. The following days became a blur of careful preparation. Archaeological teams arrived with more advanced equipment, survey drones, scanners, and protective tents to shield the area from rain. The press began to take notice, their curiosity ignited by whispers of a Viking ship beneath a farm. Yet the archaeologists worked quietly, deliberately, away from headlines. Every meter of soil was mapped and analyzed before a single spade touched the earth. The goal was preservation above all else. To uncover something so ancient required patience measured in heartbeats, not hours. The first shallow cuts into the ground revealed nothing more than layers of clay and stone. Days passed and tension grew. Some feared that the radar image had deceived them, that what they thought was a ship was only a trick of roots and sediment. But Anders remained calm. He had seen this pattern before, the slow unfolding of truth, the hesitation of the earth to give up its secrets. On the 5th day, one of the junior archaeologists, a woman named Alina, brushed aside a handful of dirt and froze. There, beneath the thin crust of soil, was a small iron rivet, perfectly round and rusted through the ages. She called out softly, her voice trembling. When the others gathered, they saw what she saw, the first undeniable trace of something crafted by human hands 1,000 years ago. That single rivet changed everything. It was a sign that the ship was real and that its preservation might be remarkable. The team worked methodically, expanding the trench outward. Within hours, they found a second rivet, then a third, forming a line that curved gently, exactly where the radar scan had predicted. The outline of the hull began to take shape, a faint arc beneath the earth. It was enormous, more than 20 meters long, perhaps closer to 30. Each new finding deepened the sense of awe. The ship had slept through a millennium of storms, its timbers reduced to shadow, but its form still whispering of power and purpose. As evening approached, the archaeologists paused to rest. They sat near the trench, watching the sunlight fade to amber. There was a strange stillness around them, a feeling of reverence that words couldn't quite reach. Anders closed his notebook and looked over the field. "It's not just a ship," he said quietly. "It's a memory carved into the ground." The others nodded, their faces lit by the dim light of the setting sun. They all understood that they were not just unearthing an artifact, they were awakening a story. In the following weeks, as word spread, the site transformed into a place of fascination. Reporters arrived, their cameras capturing the muddy boots and focused faces of the dig team. Local schools brought children to watch from behind cordons. But no one was allowed near the trench itself. Every motion was delicate, precise. The archaeologists spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the peace of the buried past. The soil gave up more fragments, remnants of planks, the impressions of ribs, small pieces of worked metal. Each artifact, no matter how small, was photographed, catalogued, and wrapped with care. By mid-autumn, the shape of the vessel was unmistakable. It had been laid carefully in a shallow pit, aligned north to south, its prow once pointing toward the open sea. The curvature of the hull spoke of a ship built for both strength and beauty, a vessel meant not just to travel, but to carry meaning. This was no ordinary burial. It was ceremonial, intentional, a send-off crafted with reverence. Perhaps a nobleman had been laid here, or a queen, or someone whose name had once commanded power over fjord and flame. The day they completed the outline, a gentle rain began to fall. The drops darkened the soil, making the shape of the ship even clearer against the earth. Anders stood at its edge, his boots muddy, his heart heavy with wonder. He imagined the day it was buried, a gathering of mourners in cloaks, torches flickering in the dusk, the scent of pine smoke drifting through the air. He could almost hear the low chant of old voices, the creak of timbers, the final shovel of dirt as the ship was sealed away. As night came, the valley returned to silence. The team packed their tools and stepped back, gazing at the gentle curve beneath their feet. Somewhere in that outline lay answers about faith, death, power, and the sea. Yet it also held questions they might never solve. Who had been buried here? What had they meant to their people? And why had this ship, of all ships, been chosen to sleep for 1,000 years? The archaeologists left for the evening, their lights receding into the mist, leaving the field to darkness once more. The rain softened, and the soil gleamed faintly beneath the moonlight. The ship lay still, a ghost of wood and iron, dreaming beneath the surface. Its secret was no longer lost, but it was not yet told. The night wrapped the valley in quiet, and the land, as always, remembered. Long before the field had a name, before fences and tractors and the hum of modern life, this land was part of a wild, restless world. The coastline of Norway stretched like a broken ribbon, its fjords cutting deep into the earth, its mountains rising like guardians over the sea. The air smelled of salt and pine, and every breath carried the taste of the ocean. It was here, in this raw and beautiful landscape, that the Vikings were born, not from cities or empires, but from wind and water, from hunger and courage. Their lives were woven into the rhythm of nature, where survival meant strength, and strength meant legacy. In those distant centuries, small settlements dotted the edges of fjords. Smoke from longhouse hearths curled into the gray sky. Men mended nets or sharpened blades while women wove wool, their hands working with quiet skill. Children played near the shore, their laughter mingling with the cries of seabirds. When night came, they sat by the fire and listened to stories, of gods who walked among men, of heroes who sailed beyond the edge of the known world, of the great hall of Valhalla where warriors feasted for eternity. For them, the world was alive with spirits and meaning. Every wave, every stone, every storm carried a message from something larger than themselves. The sea was both their ally and their greatest test. It gave them fish and trade routes, but it also demanded respect. The longships they built were not just tools, they were extensions of their souls. Crafted from oak, shaped by axes and faith, these ships were miracles of engineering and poetry. Their hulls flexed with the waves, moving as if breathing with the ocean itself. When a Viking ship cut through fog at dawn, its carved dragon head rising above the mist, it wasn't merely traveling, it was declaring existence, defying oblivion. To sail was to live fully, to die at sea was to die with honor. Yet beyond their fierce reputation as raiders, the Vikings were builders, traders, explorers. They sailed to Britain, France, Iceland, and beyond, reaching the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. They brought with them not just weapons, but art, language, and craft. They traded amber and furs for silver, spices, and silk. They built settlements that would one day grow into towns and cities. Their influence rippled across continents, shaping Europe in ways history still tries to measure. To understand the ship buried in that Norwegian field, one must understand this paradox. The Vikings were destroyers, but they were also dreamers. The rhythm of their world was one of contrast, violence and beauty, faith and fear, exploration and longing. A Viking might fight by morning and carve poetry by night. Their runes, etched into stone and wood, carried both messages of conquest and prayers for peace. Their sagas, passed down through centuries, told not only of war but of love, loss, and fate. Every life was part of a larger pattern, woven by the Norns, the mythical weavers of destiny who decided when each thread would end. And when death came, it was not the end, but a passage. That belief in passage is what gave rise to ship burials. To the Vikings, the ship was more than transport. It was the vessel of the soul. When a great leader, warrior, or noblewoman died, their body was placed in a ship surrounded by treasures, animals, and offerings. The ship was then buried or set aflame, symbolizing the final voyage to the next world. Fire and earth, two forces of transformation, carried the dead into eternity. Each burial was a bridge between realms, the living sending their dead across the horizon, knowing they would one day follow. The ship now sleeping beneath that Norwegian field was part of this tradition. It was not built merely to cross the sea, but to carry someone across eternity. Every plank, every rivet, every carving had meaning. Perhaps the ship's prow once bore a dragon's head, meant to frighten away evil spirits. Perhaps its deck had been draped with woven cloth, its hull filled with gifts for the gods. The Vikings believed that how one was buried reflected who they were in life, so whoever rested inside that ship had been someone of immense importance. To imagine that burial is to imagine the end of an era. Picture the gathering, torches flickering in the dusk, mourners standing in silence as priests murmured words to Odin and Freya. The smell of burning pine filled the air, mingled with salt from the nearby sea. A ship, once full of motion and life, was now at rest. Flowers, weapons, jewels, each offering placed with care. The dead were not gone, they were merely sailing to another shore. The mound of earth that would cover the vessel was not meant to hide it, but to protect its journey. Centuries later, the soil closed over everything. Rain and frost, season after season, pressed the ship deeper into the embrace of the land. The people who buried it were forgotten, their names worn away like carvings on driftwood. Yet their work endured. The ship remained, its form preserved in silence, waiting for someone to listen again. Now, as archaeologists stand above that same earth, they are not just uncovering wood and metal, they are reconnecting with an entire world of faith, fear, and wonder. Every detail they find pulls back the veil of time. The field, once ordinary, becomes a map of the human spirit, of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. The Viking world lives again in their careful hands. It was a world of storms and sagas, of restless hearts and eternal seas. And somewhere within that buried ship, the echo of that world still hums softly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. The morning of the first excavation dawned gray and cold. A thin fog drifted low over the valley, clinging to the trees and curling around the knees of the archaeologists as they walked toward the marked field. The ground, damp with overnight rain, carried the scent of wet clay and moss. 4 weeks they had planned this moment, balancing scientific precision with the reverence of ceremony. They knew what waited below, or at least they thought they did. But knowing and seeing are different things. As they gathered their tools, there was an unspoken understanding among them. Once the first shovel pierced the earth, there would be no going back. The past was about to breathe again. The first cuts were shallow, careful. Metal met soil with a muted scrape, each sound echoing faintly in the morning air. The team worked slowly, clearing away the uppermost layers of soil, no deeper than a few centimeters at a time. Every movement mattered. They brushed away dirt with soft hands, documenting every fragment, every change in color or texture. Hours passed in near silence, except for the rhythmic sound of shovels and the low murmur of observation notes. It was not the dramatic unearthing people imagined from movies. It was meditative, precise, like a dialogue between the living and the dead. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds. A pale light fell across the field, illuminating the faintest outlines in the exposed soil. Anders knelt at the edge of the trench, squinting at a darker streak running diagonally through the lighter clay. He reached for a brush and carefully swept the surface. The line extended, curving gently, its shape familiar and yet ghostly. "Here," he said quietly. "The hull." The others gathered around, their shadows falling over the fragile imprint. They could not see wood, only a pattern, the memory of wood, preserved in soil that had hardened around it like a mold. The ship had vanished, but its form remained, an echo trapped in the ground. The discovery carried an eerie beauty. The soil itself had become a canvas of time, painted in layers of brown and gray. Each sweep of a brush revealed something new, a rivet, a patch of darker earth, the faint trace of planking. The archaeologists worked in a rhythm that felt ancient, their motions slow and deliberate, as though afraid of waking something that still dreamed beneath them. They uncovered small bones, perhaps from animals once placed in the burial as offerings, and bits of charcoal that hinted at a ritual fire. Every find deepened the mystery. Around them, the wind picked up, whispering through the grass like the soft sigh of the sea. The archaeologists could almost imagine the sound of waves, the creak of a ship's hull, the pull of oars cutting water. Anders paused to rest, wiping the dirt from his gloves. "Imagine the day they buried it," he said softly. "They must have stood right where we are now, looking at the same hills, the same sky." The thought settled heavily over the team. Time, it seemed, was not a straight line but a circle. The living and the dead shared the same ground, separated only by the thickness of earth. As the excavation deepened, they began to see more defined structures. The keel line, the impression of ribs, the faint curve of the prow. It was larger than expected, over 20 meters in length, its bow facing slightly northwest, toward the distant sea. The soil had compacted around the ship's frame so perfectly that even the smallest details, the taper of the hull, the spacing of rivets, were preserved. It was as though the earth had chosen to remember what time had tried to erase. The archaeologists could trace its shape with their fingertips, feel the ghost of craftsmanship that once carved its curves. Each discovery carried emotion. When they found the outline of what appeared to be a burial chamber at the ship's center, the team fell silent. It was there, a rectangular shadow amid the arc of the hull. Anders crouched beside it, the cool wind brushing against his face. He knew that whatever lay within would tell the heart of the story. For now, they would not disturb it. They would approach carefully, layer by layer, documenting everything before reaching the chamber itself. Around him, the others continued their quiet work. Cameras clicked, brushes moved, soil shifted softly. The day stretched long into evening. The light turned amber, and the fog began to return, rolling down from the hills in gentle waves. The excavation site took on a strange beauty under the fading sky. A grid of ropes, tools, and soft earth glowing gold in the dusk. The archaeologists' movement slowed, not from fatigue but from awe. There was something sacred about what they were uncovering. This was not just an object of study, it was a bridge between worlds. The ship had carried someone into death, and now, in being uncovered, it carried the living into remembrance. When they finally stopped for the night, the field lay transformed. What had once been an ordinary patch of farmland was now a window into the Viking age, a place where time had folded in on itself. The faint outline of the ship stretched across the trench like a sleeping giant. The air seemed to hum with quiet energy, as though the past itself were exhaling. The archaeologists packed their tools in silence. No one wanted to leave, not yet. They stood for a long while, staring at the shape in the ground. Anders turned once more before walking away. The mist was rising again, erasing the details of the excavation, blurring the lines between what was real and what was remembered. Somewhere beneath his feet, under layers of soil and centuries of silence, the ship waited, its story still sealed, its secret still safe. The earth had begun to speak, but it had not yet finished. The first cut had been made, and the whisper of the past was growing louder. Days passed, and the outline of the ship grew clearer. What had first appeared as faint discolorations in the soil was now unmistakable. A massive vessel buried with intention and precision. The excavation grid spread wider, ropes stretching across the earth like a map of veins. The archaeologists moved carefully within it, trowels and brushes replacing shovels, their hands working as delicately as surgeons. With every inch uncovered, the ship began to take shape in their minds. The curve of the bow, the slant of the sides, the symmetry of a masterpiece hidden in silence. The more they revealed, the more awe turned into reverence. This was no fishing boat or small trade vessel. It was immense, built with a craftsman's devotion and a leader's purpose. The soil still held the dark stain of oak planks long since decayed, their grain etched into the earth like veins in stone. Iron rivets lined its ghostly frame, marking the ribs and keel, each one a testament to precision. The vessel had once cut through water like a living creature, sleek and strong, built for both power and grace. To look upon it, even in ruin, was to feel the ambition of its builders, the sense that this ship had been made not only to sail, but to be remembered. Archaeologists took measurements, sketching its perfect proportions. 23 meters from bow to stern. Nearly 5 meters wide. A ship meant to cross seas and carry stories beyond horizons. Anders traced his fingers along the faint ridge that had once been the prow, and he could almost see it, rising out of fog and salt spray, a dragon's head carved at its tip, teeth bared, eyes wide and eternal. Viking ships were often given souls through their carvings. They were protectors and symbols, guardians of those who sailed them and those who rested within. If this ship carried the dead, then its guardian had watched over them for 1,000 years. As the trench deepened, fragments of carved wood began to appear. The pieces were fragile, dark as charcoal, and had to be stabilized immediately. Even the smallest splinter carried weight, each carving hinted at beauty and power. One piece bore the faint pattern of intertwined beasts, serpents looping into each other, endless, eternal. Anders held it in gloved hands, the detail barely visible, and knew it had once been part of something extraordinary. This wasn't built for war, he said softly. It was built for ceremony. The others nodded. Everything about the ship, the craftsmanship, the location, the burial, spoke of reverence, not battle. This was a vessel of transition, built for someone whose life had meaning beyond conquest. Comparisons soon arose to the great Viking burials at Oseberg and Gokstad. Yet there was something different here, something uniquely mysterious. The Oseberg ship had been filled with treasures and the remains of 2 noblewomen. The Gokstad ship had carried a chieftain, his weapons and horses buried beside him. But this ship, its design was older in some ways and yet more refined. The curvature of the hull was sharper, its layout more deliberate. It seemed to bridge eras, a vessel born of ancient tradition but shaped by evolving beliefs. The archaeologists debated what that meant. Was this ship part of a forgotten lineage of royal burials? Or was it built for someone outside the expected order, someone powerful in ways history no longer recorded? Evening after evening, the team worked beneath the changing light, documenting each inch of progress. Around them, the countryside remained calm, the distant hum of life continuing unaware of the rediscovery unfolding below. When the wind blew across the trench, it carried the scent of sea salt, though the coast lay miles away. It was as if the air itself remembered what the ship had once been. In time, the ship's full silhouette emerged, complete and undeniable. It stretched across the field like the shadow of a sleeping leviathan. The researchers stood along its length, dwarfed by its scale, and imagined it as it must have looked 1,000 years ago, painted, carved, and alive with motion. Anders closed his eyes and saw men pushing it toward the shore, their feet sinking into sand, the sea waiting beyond. He saw it rising on the waves, the sail swelling like a lung, its dragon head slicing through mist. It was not just a ship, it was a story, a vessel of identity. Every curve, every nail, every carved line told of who these people were and what they believed about life and death. Soon after, they found signs that confirmed the ship's ceremonial nature. Around the midsection, small post holes indicated that a burial chamber had once stood there, a wooden structure built within the hull itself. The chamber had long since collapsed, leaving only a faint impression. Inside its boundaries, the soil was darker, richer, and filled with microscopic traces of organic matter, remnants of cloth, wood, and perhaps even human remains. The discovery stirred something deeper in the team. Beneath the grandeur of the vessel lay a human story waiting to be told. Someone had been placed here with care, honored with this extraordinary send-off. As night descended on the site, Anders remained behind, standing near the prow. The others had packed their equipment, their footsteps fading into the dark. He stayed, listening to the wind move through the grass. The field seemed almost to breathe. He imagined the day of burial, the sound of oars, the chants of mourners, the flicker of firelight on polished wood. He could almost hear the rhythm of drums, the murmur of prayers spoken to gods whose names had since been lost. The ship would have gleamed in that twilight, its carvings alive, its deck covered in woven cloth, its hull filled with offerings for the afterlife. Anders knelt, brushing the soil once more, tracing the faint outline where the dragon's head would have risen. "You were meant to be seen," he whispered. "And now you are." For the first time in 1,000 years, the shape of the ship met the open air. The ground that had guarded it for centuries had surrendered its greatest secret. The archaeologist felt a quiet shiver, not from cold, but from the presence of something greater than discovery, something sacred. When he finally walked away, the fog was rolling in again, soft and silver under the moon. The ship lay uncovered, but the night covered it anew, wrapping it in shadow. Beneath that calm, the earth still held the echo of the past, the ship's vast form, the artistry of forgotten hands, the breath of history rising through the soil. It was more than an artifact now. It was proof of devotion, of the human desire to be remembered, to carve beauty against the forgetting tide of time. The shape of a giant had returned, and its story was only beginning to speak. The next phase of the excavation brought the greatest revelation yet. As the archaeologists began carefully removing the soil within the ship's central chamber, they uncovered traces of what could only be described as a burial arrangement, disturbed but not destroyed by the ages. Beneath layers of compacted earth, small fragments of bone began to emerge, chalky white against the dark soil. Around them were the faint remnants of textile patterns, impressions left where fine fabrics had once lain. Each tiny thread carried whispers of a ceremony long forgotten, a moment when the living had stood in solemn silence, lowering their dead into a vessel bound for eternity. The first definitive clue came when Anders brushed away the soil from a corroded piece of metal, revealing the shape of an ornate clasp. Its design was intricate, two interlocking animal heads, their jaws biting into a circular ring. Though dulled by time, its craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was not the possession of a common man or woman. It belonged to someone of immense status, perhaps a chieftain, or someone whose spiritual power commanded reverence. The find electrified the team. This was the first physical confirmation that the ship had been a burial of importance, an offering to memory and the gods. Slowly, the outline of a wooden coffin-like structure emerged within the ship's hull. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, its impression in the soil remained, as clear as a ghostly shadow. Around it, the team found the faint remains of grave goods, small iron nails that might have held boxes or chests, pieces of worked bone, and traces of decayed leather straps that hinted at ceremonial garments or bindings. Each new artifact was carefully logged, photographed, and lifted with the gentlest of tools. The process was painstaking, a dance between reverence and scientific precision. Days turned into weeks, and the chamber began to yield more secrets. Near the supposed head of the burial, Anders discovered what looked like the shattered remnants of a weapon. At first, it appeared as little more than a rusted stain, but once cleaned and stabilized, the outline of a sword revealed itself. The hilt was decorated, the blade long since consumed by corrosion. Yet even in ruin, its form carried weight, a symbol of leadership, protection, and journey. Viking burials often included weapons not as tools of war, but as spiritual companions for the voyage to the afterlife. Whoever rested here was meant to sail armed into eternity. Further examination uncovered delicate metal fragments shaped like scales. It was armor, possibly ceremonial, possibly worn by the deceased in life. The discovery deepened the mystery. No other ship burial in this region had produced such signs of martial identity paired with ceremonial purpose. Anders stood by the trench one evening, his notebook heavy with notes, his thoughts heavier still. This wasn't just a burial, he murmured. It was a statement, a declaration. The placement of objects within the chamber suggested intentional design. At the foot of the burial lay traces of a wooden bowl, its impression still visible. Nearby, the residue of organic matter hinted at food offerings, perhaps grain or fruit, left to sustain the soul's journey. A small iron ring was found near the left side of the skeleton, its function uncertain, but its presence symbolic. Every detail spoke of belief, the merging of practicality and mysticism, the human effort to prepare the dead for a voyage beyond understanding. One morning, as the sun broke over the field and light filled the trench, Anders noticed something glinting faintly near the ship's stern. Brushing carefully, he revealed a small disk of gold no larger than a coin. Its surface was engraved with a swirling pattern, waves, perhaps, or the coiling of a serpent. The design was so fine it seemed alive in the sunlight. It might have been an amulet, a charm, or an insignia. Gold was rare in Viking burials of this type. Its presence meant the individual interred here was of extraordinary importance. This, Anders whispered, holding the disk between his gloved fingers, might have been their seal, a mark of power or protection. The deeper they dug, the more the team began to sense that the burial was not just royal, but spiritual. The layout of the chamber aligned with celestial points. The bow faced the direction of the rising sun, symbolic of rebirth and journey. Such orientation wasn't coincidence, it was intention. The Vikings believed ships were vessels not just for water, but for the soul's passage across worlds. The person buried here was not merely laid to rest, they were set upon a voyage to the realm beyond, their ship the bridge between mortality and myth. By the fourth week, the excavation had slowed to near silence. Every movement was measured, every breath deliberate. The soil around the central remains was sifted grain by grain. Then, near the lower ribcage, they uncovered something that stopped them all. A small wooden box, crushed by time but still distinct in outline. Inside, when carefully opened, were several tiny beads made of amber, still glowing softly even after a millennium underground. The beads seemed to hum with warmth in the pale sunlight, their orange cores holding the color of trapped fire. They were likely part of a necklace or ritual adornment, perhaps placed upon the body before burial. Amber was sacred to the Norse people. It symbolized sunlight, life, and the divine essence of the gods. To find it here was no accident. It spoke of love, faith, and reverence. Anders stared at the beads, moved beyond words. Whoever buried them, he said, wanted this person to carry light where they were going. By now, the identity of the buried figure was all the team could think about. The evidence pointed to someone beyond ordinary nobility, someone whose legacy straddled leadership and myth. Some speculated it could be a queen, others a spiritual leader, perhaps a Volva, a seeress who guided warriors and kings through prophecy. The ship's craftsmanship, the richness of the offerings, the combination of martial and mystical symbols, all aligned with that possibility. A burial for a woman of immense power, both earthly and divine. As dusk fell over the site one evening, Anders stood alone by the open trench. The sky burned gold and violet, the field whispering softly in the wind. He could almost hear the sea again, the echo of oars, the sigh of waves. In his mind's eye, he saw the burial as it had once been, torches flickering, faces solemn, a ship gleaming beneath the fading sun. The mourners lowered their leader into the chamber, surrounded her with gifts, and sealed the vessel with prayers. Then they covered it all with earth, believing the ship would rise again, not through waves, but through memory. In that stillness, the archaeologist realized something profound. The ship was not just a tomb, it was a promise. A message left for the future, that greatness endures, that devotion transcends decay, and that even buried beneath centuries of silence, stories find a way to surface again. The news of the discovery spread quickly. What had begun as a quiet excavation in a farmer's field was now making its way through universities, museums, and news outlets across Europe. Articles appeared with headlines that spoke of mystery and rebirth: the Viking queen beneath the soil, a 1,000-year-old ship awakes, the lost guardian of the north. Scholars arrived from Oslo, Copenhagen, and even distant Reykjavik, each bringing their own theories, tools, and ambitions. The once quiet field was now the center of the world's attention, and Anders, though exhilarated, felt the weight of responsibility deepen. What had once been a whisper in the earth had become a voice speaking to history itself. Under the soft gray light of early autumn, the site transformed into a living museum of curiosity. Tents rose along the edges of the field, their canvas flapping gently in the wind. Equipment buzzed, cameras clicked, and hushed voices carried the language of science and wonder. Yet amid all the motion, the ship remained silent, patient, ancient, almost sentient. Its dark outline in the soil seemed to watch the newcomers, indifferent to their excitement, unmoved by the hum of modernity. The ship had waited 1,000 years. It would reveal its secrets in its own time. Anders stood at the center of it all, gazing down at the ship-shaped impression that now felt almost sacred. He had dreamed of discoveries like this, of unearthing something that could shift how the world understood the past. But this find was more than that. It was not merely history, it was memory. It was the echo of human hands, the continuation of purpose, the unbroken thread that connected him to the people who had built it. Every brushstroke of soil removed felt like shaking hands with ghosts. Soon, with greater support and funding, the team began to apply new technology. Ground-penetrating radar mapped the surrounding area, revealing that the ship was not alone. Just beyond its stern lay traces of smaller burial mounds, perhaps attendants, offerings, or family members interred nearby. There were circular depressions that hinted at standing stones or wooden posts, long vanished but still marking ritual boundaries. It became clear that this was not an isolated burial. It was a sacred site, a ritual complex. Whoever had been laid to rest here had been honored not only with grandeur but with community. One cold morning, a conservator named Liv arrived from Oslo University, bringing with her expertise in organic preservation and a quiet reverence for the dead. She was meticulous, gentle, and spoke little, but when she worked, even the wind seemed to hush. Together with Anders, she examined every inch of the burial chamber, cataloging fibers and microscopic fragments invisible to the naked eye. In the soil samples she collected, traces of blue pigment were discovered, lapis lazuli, a rare and precious mineral that had to have come from far beyond Scandinavia. Its presence meant trade routes reaching across continents, perhaps even connections to the east. The realization shook the entire team. Whoever had been buried here had access to a network of wealth and influence stretching far beyond what anyone had imagined. "This isn't just a Viking story," Liv said one evening as they looked out over the field. "It's a story of the world." The ship was a symbol not only of Norse identity but of global connection, of faith, art, and exchange. The North, so often seen as remote, was in truth deeply entangled with the civilizations that touched the Mediterranean, the Silk Road, and beyond. Each day, the excavation revealed fragments that deepened this connection. Beads of glass made in ancient Persia, iron nails forged from bog or found in distant lands, and fragments of birch bark inscriptions that hinted at written language, all whispered of a culture that was more literate, more connected, more complex than history had allowed it to be painted. The myth of the Viking as a mere raider began to crumble. In its place rose the image of a thinker, an artisan, a traveler, and a believer. But amid the scholarly excitement, Anders began to notice something subtler, something almost spiritual. Many who worked on the site spoke of strange sensations, dreams filled with waves and chanting, sudden feelings of presence when the wind passed over the ship. Once, a technician swore she heard oars splashing in water during the stillest part of the night, though there was no river for miles. Anders himself began waking in the dark hours before dawn, hearing faint echoes of voices that seemed to drift from beneath the ground. It wasn't fear he felt, it was reverence. The ship seemed to hold a living memory, a consciousness that stirred as it was being uncovered. Late one evening, when the others had gone, Anders remained by the trench, a single lantern casting a trembling light across the exposed soil. He took out his notebook, but his hands hesitated. Instead of writing data, he began to write impressions, lines about silence, sea journeys, and longing. The ship, he realized, was not only a vessel for the dead but a mirror for the living. Every culture, every age, buried its hopes in the earth, believing that remembrance could conquer oblivion. This ship, he wrote, was built not to travel the sea, but to defy forgetting. The excavation's findings were soon taken to the conservation lab, where each artifact underwent delicate restoration. The sword's hilt was stabilized, the amber beads cleaned, and the gold disc polished until its engravings shone like dawn. Yet even as the objects regained their luster, they seemed incomplete without the silence of the field. The context, the atmosphere, the whisper of time, it all belonged there. The ship had been whole not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. On the final evening before the site was to be sealed for preservation, the team gathered quietly beside the trench. No speeches, no cameras, only stillness. The light faded slowly, and for a long time no one spoke. Anders placed his hand on the edge of the trench and whispered a simple phrase in Old Norse, a line translated from an ancient rune stone, "May your voyage never end." Liv joined him, repeating the words softly, like a prayer carried by the wind. As darkness enveloped the field, a sudden gust moved through the tall grass, bending it in waves that rolled outward like ripples across water. For a fleeting moment, the air seemed to shimmer with a soft, blue light, almost like the glow of the pigment they had found, lapis lazuli, the color of eternity. Whether it was imagination or something more, none of them ever forgot it. The ship slept again, but not as before. It was no longer a secret of the soil. It had become part of the collective story of humankind. Anders looked out across the now silent field, the moon silvering the horizon. The excavation was complete, yet the true voyage, the voyage of understanding, had just begun. What they had unearthed was not merely the past. It was proof that memory survives burial, that devotion survives time, and that beneath every quiet field lies a story waiting for its voice to return. Winter came early that year, cloaking the Norwegian countryside in frost and stillness. The excavation site was now sealed beneath protective layers, its instruments removed, its soil covered once more. But inside the laboratories and conservation rooms of the Oslo Historical Institute, the spirit of the ship was alive and restless. The artifacts, carefully preserved and studied, began to weave a clearer picture of the person who had been buried within that grand vessel. Each fragment, each particle of pigment or bone, became a piece of a puzzle that told a story not of conquest, but of legacy. Anders spent long hours under lamplight, surrounded by trays of objects, metal fittings, beads, shards of iron, and bits of fabric barely visible to the naked eye. His desk was littered with sketches and maps, diagrams showing every curve of the ship's structure. Yet, for all his data and measurements, he found himself drawn most to the artifacts that spoke of identity, the ones that hinted at who the buried soul truly was. He studied the clasp with interlocking beasts again, tracing its lines with his pen. Its design reminded him of symbols found in other Viking Age graves linked to women of high status. Combined with the presence of the amber necklace, the pigments, and the ceremonial sword, the evidence leaned toward a figure unlike any recorded before, a woman of both worldly power and spiritual authority. Liv joined him late one evening, her eyes reflecting the same weariness and fascination. Together they pored over the new lab results. The isotopic analysis of the bones revealed something astonishing. The person buried in the ship had not been local. The strontium levels in the remains suggested origins far to the south, possibly from lands near the Baltic, or even the regions once ruled by the early Slavic tribes. That meant she had traveled or been brought across great distances before finding rest in the Norwegian soil. It wasn't just a Viking story, it was a story of movement, migration, and connection. The discovery sparked new theories. Perhaps she had been a foreign queen married into a Norse dynasty, a symbol of alliance between distant cultures. Or perhaps she had been a spiritual emissary, a seeress whose visions had guided leaders through uncertain times. The artifacts supported both possibilities. The ceremonial sword might not have been hers by function, but by symbolism, a token of protection in death. The amber, gathered from the Baltic coasts, could have been both currency and charm. The lapis lazuli, so rare in this part of the world, spoke of faith, divinity, and trade that spanned oceans and deserts alike. Anders leaned back in his chair and stared at the collection of objects before him. She wasn't just someone important, he said softly. She was someone remembered. Someone people loved enough to bury with beauty. Liv nodded, her voice barely a whisper. And they wanted her to sail home. The idea lingered between them. The ship as a bridge, not just between life and death, but between worlds. In the following weeks, the team reconstructed a 3D digital model of the ship and its burial chamber. When projected on the large screen in the lab, it seemed to breathe again, a ghost made of data and memory. The chamber's dimensions matched those of known elite burials, but the detailing on the hull set it apart. The woodwork patterns, based on soil impressions, showed motifs connected to fertility and prophecy, symbols often associated with Norse goddesses like Freya and Frigg. If the woman buried here had indeed been a vulva, a seeress, then this ship was not merely her tomb but her final vessel of vision, her journey into the world beyond where she would continue to guide the living through dreams and whispers. As they analyzed further, a haunting pattern emerged. In the soil samples around the burial, traces of ash mixed with pine resin were discovered, residue from torches or incense. Ritual burning. It suggested that before the burial, the ship had been blessed by fire and smoke, the elements of purification. This was a rite of passage, a cleansing before transcendence. The evidence of small animal bones, likely birds, further deepened the mystery. Such offerings were known in Viking funerary rituals to carry the soul's prayers to the heavens. Anders documented everything, yet there was something in the silence of the lab that words could not capture. At night, when the others had left, he often lingered, staring at the ship's digital projection. The curves of its bow reminded him of a sleeping serpent, coiled, powerful, eternal. He thought about the people who had built it, the ones who had carried the body to the site, the ones who had wept and sung and then walked away, leaving their grief buried with their queen. That kind of devotion was timeless. He wondered if they had ever imagined someone, centuries later, would uncover their ritual and feel the same quiet ache of wonder. Liv began to compile the findings into a report meant for publication, but even she struggled with the tension between science and mystery. "How do we explain what we can't measure?" she asked one evening, looking at the glowing model. The sense that she still watches. Anders didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the outline of the ship and said, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe she was meant to be remembered, not through certainty, but through awe." Winter deepened. Outside, the city lights glowed softly against the snow, but inside the lab, the glow came from the ancient, from things that had waited 1,000 years to be understood. Anders and Liv worked late into the nights, piecing together her final story, a queen, or seeress, who bridged two worlds. She had lived when the North was still forming its identity, when gods and spirits shared space with kings and warriors. Her burial had not been about power, but about purpose, to guide her people from the realm of the seen to the unseen. On a particularly quiet night, when snowflakes drifted like ash against the windows, Anders played a recording of the sea. The sound filled the room, merging with the soft hum of the projectors. For a moment, the ship on the screen seemed to move, rocking gently with the waves. It was easy to imagine the burial again, the sail catching firelight, the chants, the hush as earth covered wood. Liv closed her eyes and smiled faintly. "It's strange," she said. "It feels like she's still sailing." Anders watched the screen until the ship faded into darkness, replaced by the hum of the present. "Maybe she never stopped," he murmured. "Maybe her voyage continues, in us, in what we remember." And in that small, dim-lit room filled with ancient echoes, he realized that the ship was not simply an archaeological find. It was a mirror reflecting what humanity fears and hopes most, that time may bury us, but it never erases meaning. The ship had carried one woman across death, but through its rediscovery, it carried all of them, scholars, dreamers, and listeners, across the sea of forgetting. Months passed, and the Viking ship burial became more than an archaeological project. It became a legend reborn in the modern age. The research findings were published, museum exhibits were curated, and documentaries began to follow the story with cinematic reverence. The once-forgotten field was now a landmark, a sacred patch of earth visited by historians, students, and curious travelers. Yet for Anders, the discovery's true meaning was only beginning to unfold. He found himself returning again and again, standing alone at the site long after the world had turned its gaze elsewhere. Beneath the frost and silence, he could still feel the heartbeat of something greater, something alive. By early spring, the ground thawed, revealing faint traces of the trench's outline. Grass grew differently there, a subtle ripple marking where the ship had once rested. The field seemed to hum faintly, as though memory itself was blooming. Anders walked its perimeter slowly, his breath visible in the cold morning air. In his pocket, he carried a small piece of preserved oak, a fragment from the ship's keel that had broken away during preservation. He often held it between his fingers, feeling its rough surface like one might touch a relic of faith. For him, it wasn't just wood, it was a voice from across centuries. At the same time, new evidence from the lab reignited discussion about the identity of the person buried within. Carbon dating placed the burial in the late 9th century, an era of transition between pagan tradition and the slow encroachment of Christianity in Scandinavia. This revelation added new depth to the story. The burial ship, with its blend of Old Norse symbols and traces of cross-like motifs found on one metal fitting, suggested a time of dual belief, a world caught between gods and a new faith. Anders began to see the ship as more than a burial. It was a bridge between worlds, between old and new, light and darkness, sea and soil. Liv, ever the meticulous researcher, uncovered written records from medieval texts that spoke of a woman known only as the Seafarer Queen. The accounts were fragmentary, half legend, half memory, describing a ruler who united clans along the coast, whose wisdom was said to rival that of the gods. She was called the one who listened to the sea. Historians had long dismissed these references as folklore, but now, standing against the backdrop of the ship's evidence, the line between myth and truth began to blur. What if she was real? Liv said one afternoon, her voice trembling slightly. What if this is her? Anders didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the horizon, where the faint outline of fjords shimmered in the distance. If it is, he said softly, then we haven't just found her grave. We've found her echo. He imagined her, standing on the shore 1,000 years ago, wind tearing through her braids, eyes fixed on the horizon. A queen, a seeress, a bridge between the human and divine. The ship had been her temple, her vessel, her eternity. And somehow, even now, it was still carrying her story across the ages. The museum exhibit opened that summer, featuring a full-scale digital reconstruction of the burial. The projected image of the ship filled an entire darkened hall, surrounded by soundscapes of waves and chanting. Visitors entered in silence, their footsteps softened by the darkness. In the center of the display, a glass case held the restored clasp, the twin beasts biting the ring of eternity. Its surface glimmered under soft light, and for many, it felt almost alive. People lingered in front of it, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. Some described a feeling of warmth, others said it felt like standing on the edge of the sea. Anders watched from a distance, observing how the story touched those who came to witness it. He realized that the ship had fulfilled its purpose once again, not by carrying one soul into the afterlife, but by awakening countless others in the present. It was still sailing, only now through minds and imaginations. Every person who stood before the exhibit, lost in awe, became part of its voyage. In a quiet moment after the museum closed one night, Anders walked alone through the exhibition hall. The only light came from the holographic glow of the ship suspended above the floor. Its translucent hull shimmered, rippling like a reflection on water. He stood beneath it, listening to the soundscape, soft waves, creaking timbers, the faint rhythm of oars. It was all artifice, yet something about it felt deeply real. "You're still here," he whispered. "Still sailing." He placed his hand on the glass case holding the clasp, feeling its cold surface under his palm. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker, as if light had caught the metal in a breath of motion. As he turned to leave, he noticed a young girl standing near the hologram, her parents waiting by the door. She was gazing at the ship with wide eyes, utterly still. Anders paused and asked gently, "What do you see?" The girl didn't look away. "She's not gone," she said simply. "She's dreaming." The words struck him harder than any scientific discovery could have. Out of the mouths of children came the truth adults so often forgot. The past never truly dies. It dreams in the present, waiting for someone to listen. That night, Anders couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the moonlight reflect off the snow-covered city roofs. He thought about the ship, the woman, the centuries of silence, and how easily history might have buried it forever. Yet, somehow, it had endured. Against time, decay, and oblivion, it had endured. He realized then that the ship's real secret wasn't gold or power, it was remembrance. The Vikings had believed that to be remembered was to live forever. And through their devotion, they had achieved exactly that. In his final report, Anders wrote not as a scientist, but as a storyteller. The Viking ship, he began, was not meant to conquer the sea, but to preserve the soul. Its timbers have long since turned to dust, but its story endures, etched in earth, carried by wind, reborn in memory. We unearthed not a grave, but a promise, that the past is never truly gone. It waits beneath our feet, patient as the tide. Months later, when the museum exhibit began touring internationally, people from around the world stood in quiet reverence before the ship's ghostly image. They didn't just see wood and metal, they saw a reflection of themselves, a desire to leave something behind, to be known, to be remembered. The ship had become what it was always meant to be, a vessel for human meaning, carrying our stories across the sea of time. Generations passed like gentle tides against the shores of eternity. The city of Lirith entered an age of quiet brilliance, a civilization of thought rather than conquest. Scholars, dreamers, and wanderers came from across the lands to learn from the people who had made peace with the shadows of death. They came seeking not gold nor dominion but understanding. The streets were lined with gardens where memory trees grew, their silver leaves humming faintly in the evening breeze. Each leaf bore a name etched by hand, the writing so fine it shimmered like dew under moonlight. It was said that when a breeze passed through those trees, it carried the voices of those who had once been remembered, gentle whispers weaving between the branches like a lullaby of time. The keepers of names had evolved into something more profound. They were not simply historians now, but mediators between the living and the unseen rhythm of memory that pulsed beneath the world. They believed that every soul once remembered with love became part of a great current, a river of consciousness that flowed endlessly through all living things. From this philosophy grew the Order of the Silent Quill, a group of chroniclers who vowed to write without bias or pride, only truth. Their symbol was the same twin spiral that had once adorned the Queen's banner, but now drawn as two hands, palms open, facing upward to the sky. To write, they said, is to remember. To remember is to give life again. At the heart of this era stood the Hall of Echoes, still whole, still quiet. After Corin's awakening, it had ceased its ancient hum, but something deeper had taken its place. Those who entered swore they felt their thoughts slow, their hearts settle, as if the very air held a pulse of serenity. Some claimed to see faint glimmers in the marble, soft ripples of light that appeared when they spoke the name of someone long gone. The hall had become a mirror for memory itself. It reflected not the dead, but the truth the living carried within them. For 1,000 years, it remained untouched, a sanctuary for those seeking to listen to what could not be spoken. But even peace, no matter how pure, eventually meets the weight of time. Beyond Lyritha's borders, the world was changing once more. The age of empires returned, driven by hunger and invention. Machines of iron and steam began to reshape the lands, and the new kings of distant realms looked upon Lirith with envy. To them, the city's serenity was not wisdom, it was weakness. Armies began to gather at its borders, drawn by rumors that the marble of the hall was made from a stone that could never break, that within its foundations lay a power that could conquer death itself. The keepers denied such claims, but greed rarely listens to truth. The first attack came under a red sky. The invaders marched with banners of flame and engines of steel, their footsteps trembling the ground. The people of Lirith did not raise weapons. They stood in silence before their gates, candles in hand, singing the hymn of names. The melody drifted through the smoke, haunting and calm. The soldiers hesitated, unnerved by the stillness of their enemies. When they reached the hall, the commander demanded its opening. The keeper of that age, a woman named Sarah, stood before the doors and said, "What you seek cannot be taken. What you destroy will only be remembered." The commander, furious, struck her down with his blade. The crowd did not scream. Instead, they knelt and whispered her name. In that moment, the hall's marble flared with silver light once again. A wind unlike any other swept through the battlefield. The air shimmered, and every soldier froze as they heard voices, not shouts, not wails, but thousands of overlapping whispers, calm and sorrowful. They felt memories not their own, a mother's lullaby, a child's laughter, a soldier's prayer before death. The weight of remembrance crushed the will to fight. Some dropped their weapons and wept. Others turned and fled, unable to bear the tenderness of what they had felt. By dawn, the invaders were gone. The city stood untouched. Sarah's body was carried into the hall and laid beside the ancient crown that no longer glowed but still pulsed faintly with warmth. The people said the queen had spoken again, not through sound, but through the echo of love. For the next centuries, no one dared challenge Lirith again. Yet the people knew that their peace was not invincible. It had to be nurtured, tended, renewed with each generation. They established the Festival of Whispers, held once every decade. On that night, the city fell completely silent. No bells, no songs, no words. Only the sound of breath and wind through the trees. It was said that during that silence, the veil between memory and life grew thin, and the people could feel the presence of those they had lost walking among them. Some felt a touch on their shoulder, others saw faint figures in the mist, and all felt a warmth within their chest, a shared heartbeat echoing across the centuries. Still, questions began to stir among the scholars once more. How long could the bridge endure? Could memory alone sustain a civilization forever? The keepers debated endlessly, some believing the bridge must one day dissolve into pure silence, others arguing that remembrance was eternal. Among them was a young keeper named Alien, a dreamer who often sat at the edge of the hall and wrote of the stars. He believed that the Queen's Bridge was not meant to remain bound to Earth, that someday, humanity's remembrance would extend beyond death, beyond the world itself. "When the stars remember us," he once wrote, "we shall have completed her dream." His words were laughed at by some, revered by others, but none forgot them. One night, under a sky awash with silver constellations, Alien vanished. In his chamber, the keepers found his final writing carved into the stone wall. "The bridge is open once more." That night, the Hall of Echoes glowed faintly for the first time in centuries, not bright, not pulsing, but soft and distant, like starlight reflecting on calm water. The city awoke to the sight in silence, and though no one could explain it, all felt the same quiet certainty that the bridge had not ended, nor remained, but ascended. Memory had become part of the universe itself, carried upon the endless wind of time. The next morning, a child was born beneath the shade of the memory trees. She had eyes the color of twilight and a faint spiral mark on her palm. The midwife gasped, whispering an ancient name under her breath, Lysandra. The cycle, it seemed, had turned once more, not as repetition, but as renewal. The bridge endured, invisible yet eternal, stretching now not only between life and death but between past and future, earth and stars, memory and dream. The birth of the twilight-eyed child marked the beginning of a new era, though few understood its significance at first. She was named Sarai, a quiet child with an otherworldly stillness about her. From her earliest days, she would sit for hours beneath the memory trees, gazing upward as if listening to voices no one else could hear. The keepers who chronicled every sign and omen noticed that wherever Sarai went, the leaves of the trees seemed to shimmer faintly even without wind. Animals followed her silently through the gardens. The old scholars began to whisper. Some said she bore the mark of the Queen reborn, others believed she was the echo of the bridge itself, a living continuation of what Lysandra had begun so many ages ago. As Sarai grew, her gift became undeniable. She could recall things she had never learned, speaking names that had long been lost to time. Once, during the Festival of Whispers, she stood before the hall and softly recited an ancient lullaby that no living person remembered. The elders wept. It was the song of the first night, the hymn sung when Lysandra was crowned. "She remembers what even we forgot," said the high keeper. "She is not the bridge, but the memory of the bridge itself." From that day, Sarai was taken under the care of the keepers, raised within the marble corridors of the hall where the hum of centuries still lingered beneath the silence. The world outside Lirith, however, was once again shifting. The age of reason had begun to rise in distant kingdoms. Machines that defied nature were being built, and men who sought immortality through science scoffed at the ancient philosophy of remembrance. "Memory cannot conquer death," they declared, "only mastery over life can." Slowly, the world began to forget the old ways. Libraries were torn down to make room for factories, archives burned in the name of progress. Travelers who once came to Lirith seeking wisdom now came with questions tinged with mockery. They saw the city's silence as superstition, its rituals as relics of a weaker time. The keepers, though steadfast, began to fear that humanity's faith in memory was waning. Sarai, still a child, sensed this decay in the rhythm of the world. She would wander the hall at night, listening to the quiet pulse beneath the stone. "They are fading," she told the high keeper one evening. "The voices, they grow tired." The old woman placed a trembling hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Then you must learn to remember for them all." And so she did. She read every volume of the Chronicle of the Bridge, memorized every story, every name, every vow spoken since Lysandra's reign. But she also began to write her own. Her writings were different, poetic, dreamlike, filled with visions of stars and rivers of light. "The bridge is not of stone or soul," she wrote, "but of time itself. And time, too, remembers." When Sarai turned 15, a new calamity arrived. Far beyond Lyritha's borders, an empire that had forgotten the old world built a weapon they claimed could rewrite the fabric of life and death. They called it the Furnace of Rebirth, a machine meant to resurrect matter itself, to conquer mortality through force. But in their arrogance, they unleashed something they did not understand. The skies grew red for 7 days, rivers boiled, and shadows detached from their owners, wandering aimlessly across the earth. Refugees fled to Lirith, bringing tales of cities where the dead walked, not in peace, but in confusion, souls wrenched from rest, lost and frightened. The keepers realized the unthinkable had happened. The balance Lysandra once forged was breaking. One night, as the sky burned faintly in the east, Sarai stood before the Hall of Echoes, her long hair drifting in the wind. "It is time," she said. The keepers gathered around her, uncertain. "Time for what, child?" asked the eldest. Sarai looked up at the stars. "For remembrance to wake again." She stepped forward, pressing her palms against the marble doors. The spirals carved there shimmered, and the hum, the sacred hum that had been silent since the time of Corin, returned, soft but steady. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet. The hall glowed from within, light blooming like dawn across its surface. The people of Lirith rushed into the plazas, staring in awe as the ancient radiance returned to their queen's monument. Inside, Sarai walked alone. The air was thick with warmth and the scent of lilies, the same flowers that once crowned Lysandra's final vigil. She followed the light to the heart of the hall, where the old crown rested upon its pedestal of glass. For centuries it had lain dormant, its silver dull with age. Now it pulsed faintly as if recognizing her. She reached out, and as her fingers brushed the metal, visions flooded her mind. She saw Lysandra as a child, her laughter, her defiance, her sorrow. She saw Marin writing by candlelight, Ilara whispering her vow, Corin's tears in the storm, Sarah's final breath upon the steps. All of them, every soul that had ever remembered, rose within her like stars in an infinite sky. And in that moment, Sarai understood. She was not the queen reborn, but the memory of memory itself, the living continuation of all who had loved and been loved. The crown lifted from its pedestal, weightless in her hands. She placed it upon her brow, and the hall erupted in light. The marble veins shone silver and gold, spiraling outward in patterns that reached through the entire city. People fell to their knees, shielding their eyes as warmth washed over them, a wave of emotion unlike anything they had ever known. They felt the presence of the dead, not as ghosts, but as love itself, their ancestors, their friends, their forgotten names returning as gentle echoes in their hearts. Across the land, the red sky faded. Rivers cooled, shadows rejoined their bodies. The lost souls found peace once more. The furnace of rebirth went silent, its fires extinguished by something no machine could rival, the power of remembrance made whole. When the light finally dimmed, Sarai stood at the center of the hall, the crown still faintly glowing upon her head. She looked exhausted, but serene. "The bridge endures," she whispered softly, her voice echoing through the marble. "Not because we built it, but because we never stopped walking it." The keepers fell to their knees. Outside, the first rain in months began to fall, washing the city clean. The people of Lirith lifted their faces to the sky, feeling the drops as blessings, as tears of joy from a queen who had once defied death and whose legacy now lived on in a girl who remembered everything. That night, the stars above Lirith burned brighter than ever before. Some swore they saw a faint shape among them, a bridge of light stretching across the heavens, endless and serene. And though no one could say for certain what it meant, all who looked upon it felt the same quiet truth settle in their hearts, that as long as one soul remembered, love would never die, and the war between the living and the dead would never return. Years passed after the awakening of the hall, and the legend of Sarai became inseparable from the rhythm of life in Lirith. The world beyond its marble gates began to stir once more, healed but forever changed. Empires that had once worshipped the machine turned their gaze toward remembrance again. The scholars who had dismissed Lirith's quiet ways sent their emissaries to learn from its keepers. They came humbly, no longer as conquerors but as pilgrims, seeking forgiveness for the arrogance of forgetting. And the keepers welcomed them, not with sermons or judgment, but with stories. For that was how peace had always been made in Lirith, not by sword or treaty, but by remembrance shared aloud. Sarai grew older, though her presence seemed untouched by time. She no longer wore the crown, which she had returned to its resting place beneath the hall's central arch. "It belongs to memory," she said when asked. "And I belong only to its song." Each dawn, she would walk the city streets, barefoot, her fingers brushing against the carved names along the walls. She spoke softly to each one, as if greeting old friends. The people adored her not as a queen, but as something gentler, an echo of compassion made flesh. They said that when she smiled, even grief grew lighter, and when she wept, the rain followed. Her voice became the city's heartbeat, calm and eternal, guiding them through an age of luminous quiet. Under her guidance, the keepers established the School of Still Voices, where children were taught not only the histories of the past but the art of listening, to silence, to memory, to the spaces between thoughts. Lessons were never written in ink but spoken and then remembered by heart. "A word that lives only on paper," Sarai said, "is a body without breath. To remember is to breathe for those who cannot." These teachings spread far beyond Lirith. Across the lands, people began to speak their dead's names aloud again, to plant memory trees, to gather beneath starlight in silence. The old rituals returned, not as superstition, but as truth rediscovered. The bridge between the living and the lost had not only endured, it had expanded across nations. But with peace came a new question: what becomes of remembrance when there is nothing left to mourn? The generations born into Sarai's age knew no war, no famine, no grief. Their lives were gentle, their days serene. Yet in the stillness, some began to wonder what it meant to remember without suffering. They feared that the bridge, though eternal, might one day become a circle with no beginning or end, a harmony so perfect it would forget its own song. Sarai listened to these doubts in silence, for she too had begun to sense the stillness growing deeper, beautiful but hollow. The hum beneath the hall was softer now, its rhythm slower, as if the heartbeat of the world was drifting into a kind of cosmic sleep. One evening, as twilight bathed the city in pale gold, Sarai stood before the hall once more. The marble reflected the fading light like a mirror of eternity. "You have given them peace," said a voice behind her. It was Elian's descendant, a keeper named Taran, who had long studied the stars as his ancestor once had. "But peace is fragile. What if they forget again?" Sarai smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "They will," she said. "All things are forgotten in time. Even love, even light. But forgetting is not the end. It is how remembering begins again." She looked up at the heavens, where the faint shimmer of the celestial bridge still arched between constellations. "That is why it must sleep," she whispered, "so that one day it may dream again." That night, the stars dimmed slightly, as though veiled behind a soft mist. The air in Lirith grew unusually still. People awoke to find the memory trees shedding their silver leaves, carpeting the streets in shimmering drifts. The hall's light flickered for the first time in centuries. Sarai gathered the keepers within its walls, her expression serene though her eyes glistened with tears. "The bridge must rest," she said. "We have carried remembrance as far as it can go in this form. The world must forget again, to rediscover what it means to remember." Her words frightened them. "If the world forgets," one keeper pleaded, "will not everything we are fade?" Sarai reached out and touched the marble wall beside her. "No," she said softly. "The bridge was never meant to be held. It was meant to flow." As the final leaves fell, Sarai began the ritual of release, a ceremony lost since the days of Lysandra herself. She knelt at the heart of the hall, her hands placed upon the marble floor. The air shimmered, and the faint hum returned, rising slowly into a song of infinite tenderness. It was the sound of every memory that had ever been, merging into one endless note. The people gathered outside felt it in their bones, a vibration that filled them with warmth and sorrow and love all at once. Above them, the stars flared bright, then dimmed again, their light absorbed into the vast hush of the cosmos. The bridge was closing, not as a door, but as an eyelid. The world, it seemed, was ready to dream. When the song ended, the hall fell silent. The marble lost its glow, and the great sigil at its gates faded from sight. The people entered to find Sarai gone. Only her robe remained, folded neatly beside the crown. In its place, a single silver leaf lay upon the floor, pulsing faintly with light. The keepers wept but did not despair. They understood now what she had meant, that memory must rest so that love can awaken anew. They sealed the hall and planted a grove around it, letting nature reclaim what was once sacred stone. Over the next 100 years, the marble was covered by vines, and the hall became one with the earth. In time, the story of the child queen and the echo of memory faded from the world again, becoming myth once more. Children in distant lands would sometimes dream of silver bridges in the sky, of a girl with twilight eyes whispering their names, of a hall that breathed beneath the ground. And though they could not name her, they woke with peace in their hearts and the faint scent of lilies in the air. The bridge had gone to sleep, but it still dreamed, softly, eternally, waiting for the day when humanity would remember once more and call its name again. Centuries passed, and the Hall of Remembrance lay buried beneath the roots of time, hidden beneath forests that whispered ancient lullabies. The world above had changed beyond recognition. Kingdoms had fallen, oceans had shifted, and even the stars in the night sky seemed to hum with new constellations. The bridge that once connected memory and being now slept in silence, its pulse faint but alive, like the heartbeat of something divine that refused to die. The stories of Sarai, the child queen, had drifted into legend, then into dust. Yet sometimes, in moments between dusk and dawn, wanderers felt the faint echo of her voice, a whisper that did not belong to the wind, reminding them that the world was never truly alone. In a distant era, long after the age of empires and machines, the earth was ruled not by kings or scholars but by dreamers. They were known as the echo-binders, people who believed that the dreams of humankind were threads of a single tapestry. They gathered stories, visions, and songs, not to archive them but to keep them alive through retelling. Their leader, a woman named Erin, was unlike any who came before her. She was neither prophet nor queen, but she carried within her a quiet knowing that made even silence seem sacred. In her childhood, she had dreamed often of a marble hall glowing beneath the roots of trees, and of a girl standing at its heart, smiling through tears. That dream had stayed with her through every season of her life. One morning, as the sun rose pale and trembling over the horizon, Erin felt something stir in her chest, a resonance, a soundless call. She followed it into the forests beyond her city, walking for days without rest. The forest seemed alive, guiding her deeper with shifting paths and flickering lights that danced like embers in fog. Finally, she reached a clearing where no birds sang, and the air was heavy with the scent of stone and rain. There, half buried beneath vines and moss, stood the remnants of a grand archway carved from white marble, its surface cracked yet glowing faintly from within. The symbol of the old bridge, long thought lost, was etched upon its center. Erin fell to her knees, trembling, not from fear, but from recognition. The dream was real. She brushed away the earth with her hands, uncovering a series of glyphs, softly pulsing with light as though they had been waiting for her touch. The ground beneath her shifted, and a soft hum rose from the depths. The world around her seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sigh like the exhale of eternity, the hall awoke. The vines receded. The marble gleamed once more, as though it had never known ruin. A door of light opened before her, and Erin stepped inside. What she saw within defied the language of her time. The walls shimmered with spectral figures, echoes of lives long past, faces both ancient and unborn, all moving within streams of silver light. At the center of the chamber stood the silver leaf that Sarai had left behind, floating above a basin of still water. As Erin approached, the leaf pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She reached out, and when her fingertips brushed its surface, a flood of memory poured through her. She saw Sarai standing in the same chamber centuries ago, her face radiant with peace. She felt the sorrow of the world before the sleep, the wars, the forgetting, the silence, and then the quiet grace that had followed. Tears streamed down Erin's face as she whispered, "You remembered us." A voice answered from the air itself, soft as a sigh. "No, child. You remembered yourself." The chamber filled with light, and for an instant, time dissolved. Erin stood upon the celestial bridge itself, stretching infinitely between realms of existence, its surface woven from starlight and memory. Across it walked countless souls, those who had lived, those yet to come, all bound by the same pulse. In that moment, Erin understood that the bridge was not a place but a rhythm, a pulse within every living being. It was the song of existence, the eternal conversation between remembering and forgetting, between life and sleep. When she opened her eyes again, she was kneeling beside the basin, the leaf still floating, glowing brighter than before. The hall no longer seemed ancient or foreign. It felt alive, responsive, as though the stones themselves were breathing. She realized then that Sarai had never died. She had become the bridge. Her essence lingered in every echo, in every story ever told. The crown she once laid down was not an end to reign, but a surrender to eternity. Erin returned to her people, carrying with her a new understanding. "We have been living in half-light," she told them. "We dream but do not remember. We live but do not awaken. The bridge is not gone. It is within us, waiting for us to listen." The echo binders built sanctuaries where people could gather to speak their dreams aloud, to record not in ink but in vibration, songs of memory woven into the air itself. They began to sense the hum beneath their feet once more, faint but steady. The hall had reconnected to the world through them. Across continents, the soil warmed, and silver leaves began to sprout from the ground wherever someone spoke a name with love. Years turned into decades, and Erin's people flourished. The bridge no longer belonged to the heavens alone. It had rooted itself into the living world. Humanity had, at last, become both keeper and memory, both dreamer and dream. Erin grew old but never bitter. Often she returned to the forest, sitting by the marble archway, feeling the heartbeat of the earth beneath her palms. One night, as the stars shimmered in quiet recognition, she whispered, "Is this the end?" And a voice answered through the rustle of leaves, "There is no end, only remembering differently." She smiled, her eyes glistening like moonlight. When morning came, her followers found her seated peacefully beneath the arch, her body still but her face serene. In her lap rested the silver leaf, glowing softly once again. The echo binders built a circle of stone around the arch, not as a tomb, but as an open sanctuary. Anyone who entered could hear faint echoes of their own forgotten memories, the murmurs of lives they had once lived or dreamed of. It became a place of pilgrimage for centuries to come, a reminder that memory is not bound by time, nor love by death. And sometimes, when the night grew too still, travelers swore they could hear two voices singing softly within the trees, one of a child queen, the other of a dreamer who found her way home. The harmony lingered long after the wind had passed, weaving itself into the breath of the world, proof that remembrance, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. The centuries folded into themselves, and what had once been legend became the quiet pulse of the world's rhythm. No one spoke Sarai's name anymore, yet her presence was everywhere, woven into the hush between rain and thunder, the shimmer of moonlight upon still water. The silver leaves that had once marked the rebirth of memory now grew wild across forgotten lands, whispering softly whenever the wind passed through them. Children born in distant eras dreamed of bridges of light, of queens made of starlight and sorrow, though they did not know why. The Hall of Remembrance had long since dissolved into earth and stone, but its spirit had merged with the living world, alive in every breath, in every story shared around a quiet fire. In a time when the world was no longer ruled by empires or borders, humanity learned to move gently again. They spoke not to conquer but to remember. Villages grew around the old forest, not for worship but for peace. On nights when the stars gathered thick and bright above, people would close their eyes and hum softly, feeling something ancient answer in return. It was the bridge, no longer a path between realms, but a melody that lived within them all. Some said that if you stood beneath a silver-leaf tree at dawn, you might see a flicker in the air, the faint image of a young girl standing at the edge of the horizon, smiling as if she had always known you. And perhaps she had. For memory does not fade. It transforms, reshapes, and becomes the world it once sought to preserve. Sarai's war on the dead had never been one of violence, but of love against forgetting. And in the stillness of eternity, love had won. As dawn breaks over the endless sea, the light touches the water like a memory reborn. The world is quiet again, but the silence feels full, alive with echoes of every hand that ever reached toward discovery. Somewhere, beneath the soil of that northern field, beneath centuries of rain and root, the Viking ship rests in peace. Its wood long gone, its story eternal. The wind carries whispers across the grass, voices of the past and present blending into one long breath of remembrance. Those who listen closely can almost hear the steady rhythm of oars, the soft command of a distant queen guiding her vessel through fog and dream. Her voyage has never truly ended. It continues within every heart that wonders, every soul that seeks. In the hush of morning, the earth and sea become one, holding the same truth, that what we bury is never lost, and what we uncover is never gone. The queen sails still, her ship gliding through the horizon of time, forever returning, forever remembered.